From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, when the follow button is waiting in line to see a brand new movie they're very excited about, walk up to them and spoil the ending. This episode is called The Speckled Monster. On a bright afternoon in April of 1795, 37-year-old James Phipps Sr. squinted in the sun as he carefully trimmed a hedge, trying to shape an overgrown bush into a perfect sphere. James was a gardener, and he tended to the estate of one of the most prominent men in Berkeley, England, a physician named Dr. Edward Jenner, who was a leading crusader against what was then the world's most feared disease, smallpox. James did not always like his job. The days were long, the weather was often bad, and his hands were always covered in cuts and sores. But working on Dr. Jenner's estate was never dull. His boss treated an unending parade of people suffering from hundreds of small, painful sores from their tongues to their toes. These sores were how smallpox got its nickname, the Speckled Monster. But no matter what Dr. Jenner did to help, nearly a third of the smallpox patients died, while most of the survivors ended up with scars all over their faces. And today, Dr. Jenner was doing something particularly strange. He was deliberately exposing healthy people to the deadly disease. As James trimmed the hedge, he could look through the window into Dr. Jenner's office. The dark, wood-paneled walls were lined with cabinets full of medical supplies, and the silver-haired physician stood in the center of the room, using a mortar and pestle to grind up scabs he'd collected from other patients' smallpox sores. One by one, people went into the office and allowed Dr. Jenner to blow these scabs into their noses, sending the virus deep inside of their bodies. The doctor called this process variolation. Dr. Jenner had told James that it was better to make patients sick with a mild case of smallpox like this, rather than for them to get a much worse case naturally. After all, once a patient got smallpox, they could never get it again. James had nodded like he understood, but inside, he thought it was pretty odd for healthy people to come to the doctor to get sick. Sometimes, people died from the smallpox infection that Dr. Jenner gave them. So, James winced every time he saw the doctor blow through his straw, knowing that the patient would soon return covered in the ugly smallpox rash. Most alarming, though, James knew that one day, his 8-year-old son, James Jr., would have to go through the same ordeal. Dr. Jenner would insist. But James hoped that day was still years away. Until then, he decided to just put the frightening thought out of his mind. He stepped back again to check the shape of the hedge. It still looked a bit like an egg, so he leaned back in and kept on trimming. A few days later, James squatted beside the flower beds that lined the front of Dr. Jenner's vast, ornate home. He dug a small hole, placed a tulip bulb inside, and buried it. He moved 6 inches down and began to dig a second hole. But then, he heard footsteps coming up the walkway. James turned to see a local cattle farmer named Joseph Merritt heading towards the porch. James was surprised to see him because Joseph had come by for Dr. Jenner's clinic just a few days ago. Joseph should have been stuck at home with smallpox right now, but instead, he looked perfectly healthy. The smallpox virus that Dr. Jenner blew into his nose must not have made him sick. James lifted up a dirty hand to wave, and Joseph nodded at him before knocking on the front door and heading inside. James went back to planting tulip bulbs, but he kept thinking about Joseph. He'd never seen a person get variolated and not get sick afterwards. James tried to mind his business and focus on his work, but he just couldn't shake his curiosity. So, as he moved further down the flower bed, he peeked through a window into Dr. Jenner's clinic. Joseph sat on a wooden exam table, and to James's horror, the doctor was blowing a straw into Joseph's nose. He was exposing Joseph to smallpox again. James kept looking through the glass, wondering how Joseph had managed to avoid catching smallpox the first time. And also James thought, how sick was Joseph going to get now that he had received a double dose? About a year later, in May 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner was enjoying a quiet morning in his sunroom, sipping an after-breakfast cup of tea, when he heard a knock at his door. A A few moments later, one of his servants came into the sunroom and told him that a messenger had come from a nearby village. There was a pox outbreak at one of the villagers' farms, and they needed Dr. Jenner's help. Dr. Jenner thanked the servant and immediately went to get dressed. He put on a blue coat with gold buttons and pulled his shoulder-length silver hair into a low ponytail. Then he packed his traveling medical kit with supplies, walked outside to his stable, and got on one of his horses. Dr. Jenner was the only practicing physician within 400 square miles, so he was used to traveling long distances for his patients. Luckily, this particular village was not too far away. He rode through the countryside for about half an hour, and when he spotted the farm he was looking for, he pulled on his horse's reins and slowed to a stop. Dr. Jenner got off his horse, tied the animal to a fence post, and walked towards a small house on the farm. But before he made it to the front door, it swung open, revealing a scruffy-looking man in work clothes. The farmer beckoned Dr. Jenner inside into a small sitting room. There, Dr. Jenner saw a young woman sitting on the couch, cradling her right hand. She was very pretty, with long brown hair and light eyes, but she looked like she was on the verge of tears. Dr. Jenner sat next to her and asked for her name. With a shaky voice, she said her name was Sarah Nelms. Then she held out her right hand and showed Dr. Jenner the big pus-filled sore between her thumb and pointed finger. She explained that the previous morning, she'd been out picking roses when a thorn scratched her hand. Then, this morning, Sarah had woken up with this huge sore right where the scratch had been. Now, she felt exhausted and feverish, and her hand was throbbing. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, and through sobs, she told the doctor that she was certain she had smallpox. Dr. Jenner nodded sympathetically and then gently took Sarah's hand. Her sore did look like a smallpox spot, but Dr. Jenner knew that Sarah did not have smallpox because the disease didn't start on people's hands. It started in their mouths, then spread across their faces and down their limbs. So he reassured the girl that she didn't have smallpox, but he did have a hunch about what was making her sick. Dr. Jenner turned to the farmer and asked him to point out the barn where Sarah worked. He needed to see it for himself. Moments later, the farmer led Dr. Jenner into a wooden barn where about 30 dairy cows were eating and resting. A few of the animals turned to look at the men, and Dr. Jenner approached one of them and leaned down to look at its udder. And he saw exactly what he was expecting. The cow's udder was covered in a bumpy, scabby rash. It had dozens of sores, just like the one on Sarah's hand. Dr. Jenner walked around the barn and found that every single cow had a similar rash. Dr. Jenner was not a veterinarian, but he knew that this disease was a relative of smallpox called cowpox, and it could be spread from livestock to humans. Dr. Jenner and the farmer went back into the house where Sarah was waiting, and the doctor told her that he had good and bad news. The bad news was that she had cowpox. This meant she was going to have to quarantine herself so she wouldn't spread it to anyone else, and the sore on her hand was likely going to get worse before it got better. But the good news was that cowpox was far less deadly than smallpox, so even though it would take a few weeks for her hand to heal, Sarah was very likely going to be okay. Sarah let out a small laugh of relief and let Dr. Jenner clean and dress her wound. When he was finished, the doctor shook the farmer's hand, went back out to his horse, and began his journey home. But as he rode through the countryside, an idea began to form inside of Dr. Jenner's mind, a really exciting idea. He thought about Sarah's case of cowpox that she undoubtedly got from working with those poor sick animals. It occurred to him that he had treated many milkmaids on many different farms for cowpox. However, he couldn't actually think of a single milkmaid who ever got sick with smallpox. And that reminded him of Joseph, the cattle farmer from a year ago, the one who did not get sick after his smallpox variolation. Just like Sarah, Joseph worked with cows every day, and Dr. Jenner just could not make Joseph sick with smallpox, no matter how hard he tried. This raised a question for Dr. Jenner, one that he needed to answer right away. He pressed his right leg into his horse's side, and the animal sped up from a trot to a gallop to an all-out run. Dr. Jenner held on tight, anxious to get back home. Sitting in his office chair that same afternoon, the doctor rifled through a cabinet full of local medical records. He found the file for Joseph Merritt, the cattle farmer he'd tried to variolate last year, and in Joseph's medical history, Dr. Jenner found the answer to his burning question. Way back in 1770, so 26 years earlier, Joseph had been treated for cowpox. Then, 2.5 decades later, Dr. Jenner tried to variolate him against smallpox twice, and it didn't work. It was like Joseph was already immune to smallpox, even though he'd never had it before. So Dr. Jenner wondered, what if Joseph's previous cowpox infection was what had made him immune to smallpox? And what if the doctor could use this information to help other people? Dr. Jenner might be able to deliberately expose people to cowpox, a painful but ultimately non-fatal disease, to make them immune to smallpox, a far more dangerous illness. The doctor's mind spun a mile a minute. If this idea worked, physicians could save patients from smallpox without accidentally killing them. They could stop the world's deadliest disease in its tracks. But Dr. Jenner knew he was getting ahead of himself. First, he had to prove that his cowpox theory was right. And the only way to do that would be to experiment on a patient who had never had cowpox or smallpox. And because pretty much every adult that Dr. Jenner treated had suffered from one pox or the other already, he was going to have to experiment on a child. On May 14, 1796, James Phipps Sr. held his son's hand as they walked towards Dr. Jenner's estate. They passed the hedges James had trimmed and the tulips he'd planted, but James was not thinking about his work. He was thinking about the fact that his son was about to become a human science experiment. A few days earlier, Dr. Jenner had asked James if he'd be willing to let him test his theory on Junior. The doctor believed cowpox made people immune to smallpox, so he wanted to infect Junior with cowpox, then try to infect him with smallpox. If Junior didn't get sick, it would prove the doctor's theory was correct. But if Junior did contract smallpox, it would prove Dr. Jenner wrong, and the little boy would face a 30% chance of death. At first, James said no way. Dr. Jenner's theory was mostly based on the fact that one cattle farmer, Joseph Merritt, couldn't catch smallpox. That wasn't exactly foolproof evidence. Plus, Joseph was an adult, Junior was a child, and children were almost always more susceptible to disease. James knew if he agreed, he was going to be putting his son in mortal danger. But still, James also knew that Dr. Jenner was one of the best physicians in the country, and he did trust him. But also, there was just the harsh reality that at this time, a lot of people were getting smallpox, and when they got it, a lot of them died. And so maybe putting his son in danger now was ultimately saving his life. So James ultimately agreed to the plan. He led his son up to the front door, knocked, and a moment later, a servant showed them to the doctor's office. Inside, James saw Dr. Jenner sitting next to a young brunette woman with a bandaged right hand. Dr. Jenner stood up to say hello, then leaned down and told Junior that the woman's name was Sarah and she was going to be helping with the procedure. She'd actually come out of her quarantine just for this. Junior glanced at his father nervously, and James gave him an encouraging nod. While Junior sat on the exam table, Dr. Jenner unwrapped Sarah's bandage, revealing the cowpox sore underneath. Then, the doctor grabbed a scalpel from one of the cabinets and asked Junior to hold out his arm and stay still. Dr. Jenner held Junior's wrist while he brought the scalpel towards the outside of the boy's upper arm. James put a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, and Junior drew in a sharp breath as the doctor pressed the scalpel down and dragged it about an inch across his skin. Dr. Jenner made one more cut beneath the first one, then did the same thing on Junior's other arm. Then, Dr. Jenner turned to Sarah and used the same scalpel to poke a hole in the top of her cowpox sore. Yellow pus began to leak out the top, and right away, Dr. Jenner got a small spatula to gather some of it up. Junior squirmed, but James tightened his grip on his son's shoulders to keep him still as the doctor wiped the pus directly into the cuts on both of Junior's arms. Junior looked completely grossed out, and James did too, but James was also glad that at least this part of the experiment was over. He let go of his son's shoulders, and they headed back home. Nine days later, James felt like he'd made the worst decision of his life. His son had been stuck in bed for over a week with chills, body aches, and nausea. And James knew the worst was yet to come. Even if his son recovered from cowpox, which was feeling like a big if, he still had to be exposed to smallpox. Late that evening, James brought a spoonful of stew to Junior's lips, but his son refused to eat. He was too nauseous. A voice in the back of James's mind told him that he had put his son through all this suffering for nothing. But he shook off that nagging thought, then grabbed an extra blanket to keep his boy warm. Then he told his son to call for him if he needed anything at all. Then, James blew out the candle on Junior's bedside table, went to his own room, and got into bed. And he laid there, awake, worrying about his son, until eventually he drifted off to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, James jumped out of bed and immediately went to check on his son. And to his surprise, his son was awake and smiling. Junior said he was finally starting to feel better. In fact, he was even hungry for breakfast. James was so relieved, but he did know the biggest danger was still to come. A little over a month later, on July 1st, 1796, James brought his son back to Dr. Jenner's office for the second part of the experiment. Junior sat on the exam table, looking like he wanted to sprint out the door, while Dr. Jenner took a jar of reddish powder out of one of his cupboards. It was a container of ground-up scabs from smallpox patients. James looked on uneasily as Dr. Jenner sprinkled some of the scabs into the straw and told Junior to hold the straw inside one of his nostrils. Then, once it was in place, Dr. Jenner blew the contaminated red dust into Junior's nose. Over the next several days, James kept a very close eye on his son. He was terrified that he would start developing a fever or the awful smallpox sores. One morning, 4 or 5 days after their visit to Dr. Jenner, Junior woke up with a scratchy throat, and James feared that his worst nightmare had come true. He imagined all these smallpox sores popping up inside of his son's throat, spreading across his face and down his arms and legs. He felt so stupid and guilty, he couldn't believe he'd put his child in this kind of danger. But then, Junior drank some water, and suddenly his voice went back to normal. And with a smile on his face, he asked his dad, "When can I go play outside again?" James let out a long sigh of relief and said, "Soon, but not yet." Over the next week or so, Junior continued to just sail along without ever getting sick. And finally, James was satisfied that his son was perfectly fine, and he did let Junior back outside to play. Dr. Jenner's experiment had worked, and though James and his son had no way of knowing it, they had just helped revolutionize medicine forever. It turned out that Dr. Jenner's theory was correct. Cowpox and smallpox were so closely related that contracting one disease made people immune to the other. Dr. Jenner wrote a report about Junior's remarkable immunity to smallpox, and he named his new technique vaccination, after the Latin word for cow. And the name stuck because Dr. Jenner had invented the world's first vaccine. But as incredible as this discovery was, Dr. Jenner's report was met with mixed reactions. It took years for other doctors to endorse smallpox vaccination, and even longer for the public to embrace it. But Dr. Jenner believed in his new methods so much that he devoted the rest of his life to vaccinating patients and teaching other doctors how to do the same. Over the next century, Dr. Jenner's smallpox vaccine saved millions of lives every year. Then, in 1967, almost 2 centuries after James Phipps Jr. took part in Dr. Jenner's experiment, the World Health Organization began a campaign to permanently eliminate smallpox, and by 1980, they did it. A disease that caused countless deaths and immeasurable suffering was literally wiped off the face of the earth. And it all began with a sick milkmaid, a gardener's son, and a very creative doctor. It was a bright summer day in 1906, and Dr. William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving slowly through a beautiful part of northwestern Connecticut called Litchfield County. Litchfield is a rural, very hilly area with lots of winding country roads, and the Clarks were there to try to scout out an area to build their second home. The couple lived full-time in New York City, where Dr. Clark was an oncologist, which is a cancer doctor, and he was also a professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. And while the Clarks' lives were very exciting and fulfilling in the city, they were also very hectic and chaotic, and so the reason they had settled on Litchfield as the place to look for a location for their second home is because it was the total opposite of the city. It was quiet, it was peaceful, it was perfect. And so as this couple from New York City drove along these winding backcountry roads, they eventually reached this beautiful covered wooden bridge, and after they drove across it, they got this view up onto this mountainside off to their right, and high up on this mountain was this huge, shaded, beautiful forest. And they saw there was a road that appeared to kind of spider off and go into these woods. Now, the couple had no idea what was up there, but it was just so beautiful, and they were immediately so drawn to it that they decided they would go check it out and see if maybe there was a spot for their second home in these woods. And so Dr. Clark took the car and he went up this access road, and very quickly as they began climbing up this hillside, the road became very bumpy and overgrown. It was pretty obvious that not many cars were driving into these woods, and so before they even reached the tree line, Dr. Clark had to pull the car over and park it on the side of the road, and then he and Harriet got out, and then on foot they continued up towards the forest. And once the couple actually entered the forest, immediately the sunlight faded because the canopy over their heads was so thick, and the air became cool and refreshing. And after walking for only a couple of minutes, the forest, which at first seemed very still and quiet, suddenly became alive. They could hear birds chirping and animals running around and insects buzzing, and then up ahead they saw there was this field off to the side of the road that was full of all these wild apple trees growing in all different directions. And as they got closer, they saw there was just a deer right in the middle of the apple trees eating apples directly off the branches. And then just past all these apple trees, the couple began passing these huge, beautiful patches of roses and lilacs and bright yellow bitter tansy flowers that lined the road. And then before long, the couple was stepping over these babbling brooks, and off in the distance, they could hear the sound of running water like fresh spring water coming down off the mountain. And then as the sun did began to poke through the canopy above them, it almost looked like the forest was sparkling, literally. This forest was sitting on a hillside, and the hillside, which was made up of rock, had mica inside of it. And mica is a kind of mineral that when sunlight hits it, it almost looks like it's shimmering. And of course, there were the owls. As Dr. Clark and his wife walked farther and farther into this beautiful forest, they heard more and more owls hooting off in the distance. And to the Clarks, this made the forest feel enchanted. It was like the owls were personally greeting them. By the time the couple had turned around and begun heading back to their car, they had already made up their mind that they were going to build their second home in that forest. And so, after returning to their home in New York, they promptly put in the paperwork to purchase 1,000 acres inside of that Connecticut forest. And that forest had a name. It was called Dark Entry, and it was named that because it looked like from the outside, the forest was basically dark all the time. There was shade cast on it from mountains nearby, and then also the canopy inside of Dark Entry is exceptionally thick. At one time, there actually had been a town inside of Dark Entry Forest. However, all the people who had lived in that town were now all gone. The only remnants of this town were a couple of crumbling stone walls and a couple of home foundations that were scattered about the Dark Entry forest floor. The Clarks had seen some of these ruins as they walked along this overgrown path through the forest, but they weren't concerned. Instead, they felt like these ruins actually added some charm to the forest. After the land purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark began looking for local builders in Connecticut who could help him build this second home inside of Dark Entry Forest. But no matter how much money he offered these local Connecticut builders, they all said no. Now, none of them gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they were turning him down, so Dr. Clark just kind of assumed that, hey, this project is not huge, it's just one house, and the forest is pretty isolated and hard to get to, and so he thought, probably these builders think it's not worth the effort. But Dr. Clark was not discouraged. He decided he would just build the house himself. After all, he was a very handy, competent guy who had grown up on a farm in New Jersey, and so he knew how to build things. And so, for the next several months, Dr. Clark would travel from New York City to Dark Entry Forest every weekend, and he would build this home. First, he cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees on this one flat patch of his land, and then with all this lumber he had cut down, he built his rustic two-story cabin on this flat part of his land. And then nearby on this hilltop, there was a freshwater spring at the top, and so he laid piping from the spring into his cabin so they could have fresh water. And then at the bottom of this nearby hill was this brook, and Dr. Clark loved just standing and watching this brook because inside of it were all these trout that would dart all around. And so Dr. Clark built a swimming pool with beautiful mossy embankments right up against this brook so he could sit there and watch the fish. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was done, and so Dr. Clark and his wife Harriet, they stayed at the cabin to celebrate the holiday. And as they were sitting in their swimming pool watching the trout and listening to the owls hoot off in the distance, they both agreed that this second home was like their little piece of heaven. So every summer from there on out, and every major holiday that they could manage it, the Clarks would travel to their home in Dark Entry Forest, and they would swim and hike and relax, and they'd watch the leaves on the mountainside turn from green to bright yellows and oranges and reds. It was perfect. That is, until 1918. That summer, the couple was in their second home in the forest when Dr. Clark was suddenly called back to New York to attend to a medical emergency. Harriet was very upset at the prospect of suddenly being left alone in this cabin in the middle of the forest by herself for who knows how many days. And so when she dropped her husband off at the nearby train platform, she made him promise that he would come back soon, and he said he would. And then Dr. Clark got on the train, it took off, and Harriet just stood there with her arms crossed, watching it as it chugged along off into the distance. From his comfortable seat on that train, Dr. Clark had no idea that his wife was about to endure a nightmare while he was gone. We've all been there. Your guests are on their way over to your house for your big New Year's Eve party, and right as they pull into your driveway, you realize you've overnogged your smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog. And so with minutes to spare, you leap out of the window, shattering the glass and cutting yourself up badly, and then you jog up to Canada and dive into Baffin Bay, and you jump on top of a narwhal, and after some intense underwater hand-to-flipper combat, you take its horn off its head, and you beat it to death. You take its horn, and then you swim back to land, and you jog back to your house, and you leap in through a different window, shattering the glass. And then after you stand up, you make your way into the kitchen, and you whip up a quick narwhal horn iced soup right as your guests are walking through the front door. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog and narwhal horn iced soup are both just gross. So your party was doomed either way. But you know what isn't gross? HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal service that delivers actually good-tasting food right to your doorstep. With over 35 recipes available every week, there is something to please everyone. Choose from family-friendly, fit and wholesome, even veggie. Plus, you can easily customize your meals or sides, upgrading your proteins, or even adding a protein to your veggie meal. And if you're going to be traveling this New Year's, HelloFresh can accommodate your schedule. You can change your preferences, delivery day, and your address in just a few clicks. So, if you're ready to stop garnishing your holiday parties with trash food and drink, then sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Okay, back to the story. When the Clarks bought their 1,000 acres in the Dark Entry Forest, they did virtually no research on the forest or the surrounding area. If they had, they very likely would not have purchased that land. You see, the town that used to be inside of the Dark Entry Forest, that was now just ruins that the Clarks saw when they first walked around inside of the forest, was abandoned for a very specific reason. It was cursed. At least that's what the locals say. And in fact, that was the reason why no builders in the area were willing to go with Dr. Clark into the forest to go build his house, because they were too scared to go anywhere near the ruins of this cursed town. This town, which was known as Dudleytown, was first settled sometime in the 1740s. At first, it was just a couple of people and a couple of small structures, but pretty quickly, 30 families had moved in and it was a thriving little town. But as the 1700s came to a close, terrible things began to happen to residents of this town. First, there was the Carter family. They moved to Dudleytown in 1759, and shortly after arriving there, 6 members of their family all died suddenly from cholera. The remaining branch of the Carter family was so grief-stricken from their losses that they left Dudleytown and went to New York, where they resettled. But almost immediately after getting set up there, Native Americans raided their property and massacred them, and the 3 people that survived this massacre were 3 of the kids, and they were all kidnapped and taken away. In 1792, a Dudley resident named Hollister died suddenly. Now, we don't know if he fell off a roof or if he was murdered, no one really knows, but what we can agree on is that his untimely death happened in the home of a man named Tanner. And Tanner, following Hollister's death, suddenly just began obsessively talking about these strange creatures he was seeing out in the woods at night, kind of roaming around the dark entry forest. And he talked about it all the time and nobody listened to him. And eventually Tanner went insane and his daughter had to care for him for the rest of his life. And while Tanner was slowly losing his mind, his next door neighbor named Abel also began reporting that he was seeing weird creatures roaming around the tree line all around the town. And as Abel continued to report seeing these strange creatures lurking in the shadows, he too slowly went mad and had to be cared for until his death. In the early 1800s, a famous Revolutionary War hero, General Herman Swift, who lived in Dudleytown, lost his mind shortly after his wife was struck by lightning. And then in 1813, an unknown epidemic rolled through Dudleytown and killed many of its residents. After that, more and more residents of Dudleytown either died suddenly or died mysteriously, and also more and more residents began coming forward with stories about having seen these strange, shadowy creatures moving around the tree line at night. By about 1900, all the Dudleytown residents had either died or simply just left, abandoning their homes, except for one family, the Brophies. But in quick succession, the Brophy family's sheep all died, then the mother died of tuberculosis, then the 2 sons were accused of theft in a nearby town, and then they just disappeared, leaving one person, John Brophy, the father. But the Brophy family home burned to the ground, and so John, who was overcome with grief, just wandered off into the forest and was never heard from again. At that point, Dudleytown officially became a ghost town. No one lived there. And it was at that point, in 1906, when Dr. Clark and Harriet had their beautiful summer's day walk through the forest and discovered where they wanted to build their second home. So, fast forward back to 1918, and Dr. Clark, he's on his medical emergency leave to New York. It winds up being very quick. He's back on a train within 36 hours, and he pulls into the station right near Dark Entry Forest, and he's expecting to see Harriet waiting on the platform for him. But when the train rolled into the station, she wasn't there. Now, Dr. Clark was not a superstitious person, but for some reason, when he didn't see his wife there, he just felt like something was off. There's no reason she wouldn't have come out here to greet him. I mean, she was worried about being all alone in the cabin, and she knew he was going to be arriving at that moment. And so, feeling a little bit panicked, Dr. Clark left the train station and on foot made his way over to the Dark Entry Forest. And when he got there and began walking on that overgrown road path that led to his house, immediately, as soon as he was within the shade of the trees, he began hearing these owls hooting very loudly off in the distance. Now, normally, the sound of these owls hooting made him feel welcome, but this time he felt scared. He felt like something was wrong up ahead. And so he began jogging through the forest, and it's very dark, and all he can hear is the sound of these owls, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. And then finally, he reaches the clearing where his property is. And at this point, it's a cacophony of owls hooting practically right on top of him. And he looks up towards his house up on this hill, and he sees the front door is slightly open. And so now now with his heart racing, wondering what's going on with his wife, Dr. Clark runs up to his front porch, he gets to the door, and he flings it open the rest of the way, and then right before he stepped into his house, this sudden high-pitched noise began up on the second floor inside of his house. And it was so startling to Dr. Clark that he just froze where he was. And so suddenly it's so loud from the owls all around him and the woods behind him and whatever this noise is that he just stood there unsure what to do. And so as he's sitting there getting the courage up to go investigate his house, he realizes what this high-pitched noise is. It's the sound of maniacal, insane laughter coming from the second floor. Sensing his wife had to be in danger, the doctor charged up the nearby steps up to the second floor, and he could tell this laughter, this high-pitched laughter, was coming from the master bedroom. And so he ran down the short hallway, he got in front of the closed door that led into the master bedroom, he slowly opened it up, and there, in the back corner of his room, was his wife. She was on the ground, rolled up in a ball, facing the door. Her hands were clenched in fists, her eyes were open and unblinking, and her mouth was open wider than was humanly possible. And as he's staring at his wife, wondering what's going on, he realizes this insane, high-pitched laughter is coming from his wife. But it doesn't even look like it's coming out of her. Her chest is just heaving, her mouth is staying open, and the laughter is just coming out of her. And so the doctor just stood there watching his wife, who's staring directly at his eyes. And finally, he just got so scared, he turned and he ran. During Dr. Clark's 36 hours he was away in New York, something happened to his wife. We don't know what it was, but it caused her to lose her mind. The only thing she would talk about was the strange creatures she saw out in the forest. By some accounts, Harriet spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum. By other accounts, she went back with Dr. Clark to New York, where she took her life. Today, Dudleytown is not only still abandoned, but it is also illegal to visit. However, people do still sneak into Dudleytown and walk around the ruins, and many of them have reported feeling these pockets of cold air where there shouldn't be cold air, and also some others have said as they've been walking, they've felt phantom hands slap them and push them. Some have said they've taken photographs inside of the Dark Entry Forest near Dudleytown, and they've captured strange, shadowy figures that they couldn't see with their naked eye. The famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, shot a special series in the 1970s inside of the Dark Entry Forest, and they declared the area around Dudleytown was demonically possessed. So that's going to... On the morning of August 12th, 2000, 33 of Russia's best naval warships stopped inside of a particular section of the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea is this 800-mile stretch of freezing water up in the Arctic Circle just northwest of Russia, and these 33 ships were in this stretch of water for this huge military training exercise. Basically, they were going to run through some war game scenarios where, for example, one ship would pretend to be an enemy combatant, and the other ships would work on locking onto that ship and firing at them. But of course, they wouldn't use real missiles or torpedoes, they would use duds that didn't actually explode. And so around 9 a.m., the man who was in charge of this entire operation, his name was Admiral Popov, and he was actually on board one of these 33 ships. He authorized one of the submarines that was out there to shoot 2 of their dummy torpedoes at a target, an enemy combatant, which was actually just one of the other ships. And so as soon as he did this, he was authorizing the start of this multi-day long exercise. And so all day and all night, they're doing these war game scenarios. And by the following morning, so 24 hours into this exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action to speak with Russian reporters on the phone. And during this interview, he tells them that so far, the training exercise is going exactly to plan and that it looks like it will ultimately be a huge success. However, there was a problem. At the same time, Admiral Popov is giving his remarks to the reporters about how well this exercise is going, the family members of some of the crews that were out there as part of this exercise, they heard a rumor that the exercise was not going to plan, that in fact, something bad had happened to one of the ships. But none of the family members had any more information beyond that. Even though this rumor was just that, a rumor, the family members of these crews that are participating in this exercise, they naturally became very worried. And so they all that morning began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had originated, asking for more information. And the phone operator on the base that was receiving all of these calls that morning at first was telling these family members that no, nothing's going on. I haven't heard anything. There's no issues. But eventually, this phone operator let slip that, in fact, they too had heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and they think it actually might be true. But when this family member who heard this pressured the phone operator for more information, the operator clammed up and said, I can't give you anything else. And so at that point, the family member hung up the phone and called the media and told them what was going on. And the media, as soon as they had the story, they went right to Admiral Popov and they said, hey, can you address this rumor? And he didn't. He did not respond to any of the media's inquiries. And in a weird way, that was kind of reassuring to the family members of these crews, because they're thinking, if Admiral Popov is just kind of ignoring this rumor and he's staying out there out on the Barents Sea still conducting this exercise, then certainly nothing bad could have happened, right? And so for the rest of that day, Sunday, the family members of these crews and the media just kind of did nothing because there wasn't anything else to do besides wait to see if there was any new news coming out of this exercise. And the following day, on Monday the 14th, so 48 hours after the start of this training exercise, there would be news. Russian officials would go on TV and they would address the rumor by saying, well, yeah, it is true. Something did happen out during this exercise. The Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines that was one of the 33 ships that was part of this exercise, they experienced some minor technical difficulties that forced them to ground their vessel at the bottom of the Barents Sea. But don't worry, this is normal. We're in touch with them through the radio. Everybody is fine. We are pumping air and power into their submarine, and before long, we will have them back on the surface. There's nothing to worry about. Now, naturally, the family members of the Kursk crew specifically, they panicked when they heard this, because even though the government is acting totally confident that everything is fine, they did not feel confident that everything was fine. Their family members are trapped on the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they remembered the Kursk, the actual submarine, was a very special and very safe submarine. The Kursk was quite literally Russia's best ship. They had spared no expense on it. It was extremely expensive. And it was massive. It was bigger than 2 football fields put together. And it was constructed out of this very specialized, highly reinforced steel that allowed it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep on going, no problem. It was also outfitted on the inside with all the latest and greatest technology. And so if you were going to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside of a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside of the Kursk. And so the families took solace in that. But over the next couple of days, despite the government reassuring everybody in the news that everything was fine, it's totally minor, we're going to have the Kursk up in no time, despite all that, the Kursk still had not been raised to the surface, and the government was not giving the families or the media any new information. And so in this kind of void of no real information, the families began to panic and the media began to speculate. Did the Kursk really suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying, or was this something more serious? This question would be answered on August 21st, so 9 days after this training exercise had begun, when a Norwegian dive team, they were out there to assist in the recovery effort, they were able to dive down to the Kursk, and they actually got inside of the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like this watertight closet that kind of sits on the outside of the submarine, and it allows people to go in and out of the submarine without flooding it. And once these Norwegian divers got inside of the Kursk and had a look around, they were totally shocked at what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated today, and probably will be for some time, there is one aspect of the story that is more or less universally accepted, and that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 watertight segments called compartments. Number 1 was at the front of the submarine, and then it went 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 9 in the very back of the submarine. And the reason we know what happened inside of compartment number 9 is because a 27-year-old Kursk crew member, Dmitry Kolesnikov, told us. Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his father's father was a submariner, and Dmitry idolized them, and so growing up, that was all he ever wanted to be. And in the late 1990s, his dream would become a reality when he commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve on board the Kursk. 4 months before this training exercise out in the Barents Sea, Dmitry met and very quickly married a high school teacher named Olga, and right after their wedding, one of the first things he did is he brought her on board the Kursk for a tour. And Olga brought along a video camera and filmed her tour through the ship. And on this video, Dmitry is all smiles. He is so happy to be leading her around the ship and introducing her to people and showing her all the cramped spaces on board the submarine. It's really obvious that Dmitry was so proud of his job. Not only of his job, but also just so proud to be sharing this part of his life with his wife. Fast forward to August 12th, 2000, and Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members on board the Kursk, had just arrived at their designated section in the Barents Sea for this training exercise. And at 11:27 a.m., the captain of the Kursk came over the radio and he told Admiral Popov, who was not on the Kursk, he was on a separate ship, he told the Admiral that the Kursk was about to fire their 2 dummy torpedoes. After this call was made, the men in the first compartment of the Kursk, so at the very front of the Kursk, this is where all the torpedoes, both fake and real, are stored, they began loading these 2 dummy torpedoes. Meanwhile, Dmitry was all the way back in the 7th compartment, the engine room. That was where he was stationed. He was actually in charge of everybody who worked in the 7th compartment. And so as these 2 dummy torpedoes are being loaded, Dmitry and his men, there weren't that many of them, they were twisting dials and pulling levers, when all of a sudden there's this really loud crashing sound, and then the ship shudders and then jolts hard to one side, as if someone had grabbed the front of the submarine and just forced it to one direction. What Dmitry and the men in the 7th compartment could not have possibly known was that one of the real torpedoes in the first compartment had malfunctioned and it exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong the exterior walls were, this torpedo, as advertised, did not puncture through it. It did a lot of damage and caused a massive fire, but the sub was not sinking. So back in the 7th compartment, Dmitry, he stands up from being jostled to the ground, and the alarms are going off and everything is totally chaotic. Everyone's asking what's going on. And Dmitry, he takes charge and he tells his men to follow the emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of your compartment. And so in this case, he sealed both the doors, one leading to the 6th compartment and the other leading to the 8th compartment. There's a lot of reasons for why they do this, but in essence, if there's a leak somewhere in the submarine, by sealing off your compartment, you protect yourself from being flooded. As Dmitry and his men are sealing these 2 doors, they would have begun to see and smell smoke as it came in through the ventilation ducts, because there was now this uncontrolled fire raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle as the captain of the Kursk desperately tried to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes and it set off this almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or once this hole in the front of the submarine, because the second blast did puncture the walls, once that hole was created, all this Arctic water began flooding into the submarine. So if you didn't get killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were anyone in the 6th compartment going backwards. So 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so Dmitry and the other men in the 7th compartment, they would have been definitely badly shaken up from that second explosion. That completely rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place. But they would have been very alive and very aware of the terrible situation they were in. And so I would imagine that Dmitry and the others tried to grab onto any of the piping or anything they could as the submarine, because the control tower has been destroyed, just angled straight down and began careening downward. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the ocean floor 350 feet below the surface, and in the back half half of the Kursk came down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for those first 2 hours after they hit the ocean floor. What we do know is they had power, so there was light inside of the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite the chemicals and smoke that was in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. During those first 2 hours, we also know that at some point, Dmitry and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the 6th compartment, because remember, they had sealed off the doors both to the 8th and the 6th compartment. And so Dmitry decided to break emergency protocol, and he opened the door to the 6th compartment to allow any of the survivors that were banging on the door to come into their compartment. And when Dmitry and his men opened that door and looked into the 6th compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding, and most likely anybody forward of that compartment, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, they were already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitry and his men in the 7th compartment and the other survivors from the 6th compartment, they were forced to retreat from the 7th over to the 8th compartment and then finally into the 9th compartment because of flooding. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls were no longer watertight because this huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all of the walls. And so it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment would fill up, it would begin leaking through all the cracks in the walls. And so Dmitry and all of the people he was with, they would have been very aware of that. And so by the time they got all the way back to the 9th compartment, the very back compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them, and they were doomed unless they got rescued or if they left out of the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitry remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper as he's sitting in this cramped 9th compartment with these 22 other men, and he writes the date and time in the corner, and then he begins to kind of describe what had happened. He talks about there being an explosion, and he thought he and these 22 men were the only survivors, and he says they're now trapped in the 9th compartment, and they have to wait for rescue. He also talks about how they had considered going out the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitry wrote this very neat, very legible, very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket, and then for the next hour and a half, he sat inside of the 9th compartment with the 22 others, and the power went out, which thrust them into absolute pitch darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there. And the temperatures, because the power was out, suddenly began to plummet. And then the worst part was the water began seeping through the walls. And so Dmitry and the other men, they would have known that it's just a matter of time before this room fills completely with water, and there is nowhere to go. And so with the water rising all around them, Dmitry pulls that paper back out of his pocket and he adds to the note. And this time, his handwriting is barely legible. And it's because he's probably suffering from hypothermia, so he's shaking. He can't see what he's writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate it's totally dark in the room. And in this second note he leaves on this piece of paper, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitry indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear none of them think they're going to survive. Then, with the remaining space on this piece of paper, Dmitry writes this very loving and very thoughtful message to his wife and his family saying goodbye. And then his final words on this note are, "Regards to everybody, no need to despair, Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message on this note, he folded the paper up, put it in his breast pocket, and then in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know how long Dmitry and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9, but experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is that Dmitry and these 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response was a little bit more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of these ships, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second explosion that the Kursk experienced, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really did anything. And then when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire those 2 dummy torpedoes, everybody else, all the other ships, Admiral Popov, they all just said, you know what, I'm sure it's just their radios and they're fine and they'll be in touch soon. And so it wasn't until later that evening when the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem with the Kursk, that the Kursk has vanished. And then it would be several hours before they even got a rescue submersible in the water down to the Kursk. And then once it was down there, they could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. And so even if there were survivors inside of the submarine, they would not have been able to exit into this rescue submersible. And so for days and days, the Russians struggled to try to get inside of the submarine and kept turning down foreign aid from Norway, from America, from Great Britain. And then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sank, the Russians did accept foreign aid, and that's when the Norwegian dive team, they went down and they were able to open up the escape hatch. And when they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when ultimately Dmitri's body was found, and they found that note tucked in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. And the families of the crew of the Kursk were given 10 years salary each. They were also given free housing in any Russian city, and their children would all have their college education paid for.